Imagine Jesus entering the desert, not to flee but to be forged. Before any public miracle, before any teaching that would alter centuries, he passed through an environment of inner pressure, a valley where identity, purpose, and obedience were tested in the heat of solitude. This same image hangs over the life of E.M. Bounds, a man whose revival impact was shaped long before his name filled pulpits, or his words ignited generations. Like Christ in the desert, Bounds found his furnace, a hidden place where his soul was hammered, heated, and transformed. What most people see today are his widely cited books on prayer, his almost superhuman fervor, and his reputation as one of the greatest intercessors in American history. But what almost no one sees is the emotional collapse, the heavy isolation, and the internal pressure that nearly destroyed him before strengthening him. Behind his profound theology lay a soul constantly being melted and recast, a man confronting his own limitations so that God could use him beyond them. That's why the true power of revival rarely springs from public enthusiasm. It springs from private agony, from moments when the soul confronts its deepest fractures, its most intimate fears, its unmet expectations. The fire that shaped E.M. Bounds wasn't visible. It didn't appear in pulpits. It wasn't in the applause. It was a silent internal fire, consuming and purifying at the same time. And to anchor this biblically, we recall the recurring image of the prophets, the refining fire, a fire that doesn't destroy, but purifies. It doesn't burn the gold. It only removes what cannot remain. This episode will expose exactly that hidden side, the spiritual, emotional, and even neurological cost behind revival. We will reveal what many admire, but almost no one is truly willing to confront. When we talk about E.M. Bounds, many imagine only the giant of prayer, the disciplined writer, the man whose life became synonymous with profound intercession. But behind this spiritual icon lay a silent pain, an inner fire that few could withstand. Here, in this first chapter, we enter the heart of the furnace where Bounds was molded, not in the pulpit, not in the books, but in the place of emotional collapse, psychological pressure, and inner reconfiguration that almost no one mentions. Bounds faced a type of pain that doesn't bleed on the outside but burns on the inside, the kind of wear and tear that arises when prayer ceases to be merely devotion and becomes identity, burden, and emotional oxygen. The line between praying because I need God and praying because I'm emotionally dependent on it can become extremely thin, and Bounds lived on that border for years. This silent pressure creates a psychological phenomenon called spiritual hyper-identification, when a person begins to feel that if they stop praying intensely, everything collapses, including themselves. This is the beginning of the crucible, the emotional crucible where their soul has begun to boil. From a neurobiological point of view, long hours of intense intercession, especially carrying the pains, burdens, and anxieties of others, continuously activate the limbic system. It's a state similar to processing prolonged grief. Your brain interprets the spiritual weight as a form of constant emotional threat. This produces bodily signs, tension, exhaustion, insomnia, mood swings, and even a state of forced spiritual vigilance. This detail is crucial. The furnace doesn't appear because your prayer is weak, but because your prayer is strong enough to transform you. The fire that shaped Bounds was, in part, built by the very structure of his devotion. Here's the surprising key. The pain of the crucible doesn't mean something went wrong. It means something is being restructured, a soul being melted down to be recast. Like metal heated in fire, each moment of emotional heat sculpted a new spiritual capacity in Bounds. But this only works when there's a balance he initially lacked. For a long time, the man who preached about the power of prayer was also the man who struggled with an exhausted heart and an overwhelmed mind, and he didn't talk about it publicly. Therefore, there is a simple practice that transforms the crucible of destruction into a crucible of formation, post-intercession grounding. After praying for long periods, the body needs re-anchoring, slow breathing, prolonged exhalations, feet firmly on the ground, and a brief exercise in cognitive diffusion, that is, separating who you are from what you carry. These practices do exactly what a metal worker does with freshly heated iron. They stabilize the alloy so that it doesn't break when it cools. And it was slowly, blow after blow, that Bounds discovered in pain his greatest instrument of spiritual authority. There is a profound paradox in the path of any intense intercessor, and E.M. Bounds knew it intimately. The deeper you go into God, the easier it is to lose touch with the people around you. Not out of malice, not out of disinterest, but because inner intensity grows faster than relationships can keep up. This second chapter reveals this silent tension and the emotional mechanisms that explain why the man of prayer often becomes the man alone. The first block is simple yet devastating. Spiritual depth creates emotional imbalance. Bounds prayed for hours, days, entire seasons. He carried national pains, congregational crises, private miseries. As his spirit soared, his relational life took a backseat. Family members didn't understand. Friends drifted away. And the more God called him, the more he found himself in territory that no one in his circle could decipher. This is the beginning of involuntary solitude, not chosen, but generated by the magnitude of a calling. Neurobiologically, there is something called mirror neuron fatigue. When you spend long periods intensely empathizing in intercessions, feeling the weight of others, imagining their pain, fighting for their souls, the brain reconfigures its sensitivity. He reduces his capacity to respond emotionally to daily life because he is saving energy for big burdens. This generates disconnection. The intercessor seems distant, distracted, disconnected. It's not a sin. It's neuroscience. And Bounds experienced this without having the language to explain what was happening inside him. The unexpected truth is this. Many people who seem to choose solitude have actually been overtaken by the very spiritual movement they embraced. The calling moves quickly, faster than marriage, than friendship, than social expectations can keep up with. Then accidental isolation arises, an isolation that hurts, that corrodes, that makes the intercessor begin to confuse distance with holiness, and exhaustion with devotion. Bounds suffered this displacement. He became deeper, but also more alone. And it is here that one of the most important practices of this chapter emerges, the ritual of relational recalibration. After intense periods of prayer, the intercessor must make an intentional return. Talk to a trusted person, look them in the eye, speak about something simple, touch humanity again. It's not a waste of time. It's neural and spiritual reintegration. It's like watering the roots after growing too tall. A tree that doesn't tend to its roots, even if tall, majestic, and full of vision, falls. Such was Bounds' life, climbing the mountain with God, but always needing to learn to descend to the valley where real people lived. Only those who maintain human roots while walking on spiritual heights survive the furnace. There is a type of suffering that leaves no visible marks, but destroys faster than any physical wound, being misunderstood while trying to obey God. This was one of E.M. Bounds' heaviest burdens, not just the criticism, but the profound feeling that no one truly understood what pulsed within him. This third chapter exposes this invisible weight that has crushed many revivalists throughout history. The first pain is simple but devastating, the accusation against the man who only wanted to pray. Bounds was called excessive, radical, too mystical, useless for modern ministerial efficiency. While he knelt for hours, others judged him unproductive. While he carried cities and nations in the spirit, he was treated as inconvenient, and each of these assessments pierced the heart like arrows. There is a real psychological cost to constantly being perceived as too much. Neuroscience helps us understand this burnout. The brain reacts to public criticism in the same way it reacts to physical danger. The threat circuit, amygdala, hypothalamus, cortisol, fires instantly. This drains emotional energy, affects memory, and reduces spiritual clarity. For an intercessor, this is devastating. You try to pray, but your body is in survival mode. Many of Bounds' agonizing nights were not against demons, but against human interpretations that were tearing him apart inside. And here comes the most counterintuitive revelation of this chapter. The most destructive criticisms rarely come from the ungodly, but from brothers who are afraid of where deep prayer might lead. These are people who, seeing someone truly surrender, feel their own timidity exposed. So they attack, they diminish, they invent reasons. Resistance to spiritual movement often stems from an emotional inability to cope with what demands radical change. Bounds carried this kind of opposition to the end. How to survive this? The answer is what we call screening criticism, something any intercessor needs to master. Before absorbing any accusation, you ask yourself 3 questions. Is this just emotional noise? Is this projection, their pain projected onto me? Is there, even if painful, a grain of truth that I need to adjust? Only the third category deserves energy. The other two should be discarded so as not to steal the inner life. Bounds, if he had tools like these, would have avoided much unnecessary wear and tear. The final image of this chapter is that of a furnace whose doors are banged on by the judgments of others. Doors that make noise, try to extinguish the fire, try to intimidate the blacksmith. But behind those doors, the fire continues, silently shaping the metal. Such was the ministry of E.M. Bounds, bombarded by external voices, but sustained by a fire that no one could extinguish. There is a silent pain that almost no intercessor dares to admit. The weight of believing it is their responsibility to produce what only God can do. E.M. Bounds carried this burden for years, a constant feeling that if revival didn't happen, it was because he hadn't prayed enough, cried enough, sacrificed enough. This chapter reveals this destructive mechanism and shows how it shapes, and sometimes deforms, those who live on their knees. The first wound is the grief over unanswered nights. Bounds wrote about the depth of prayer, but he also lived through long periods of divine silence. It wasn't a lack of faith, it was the internal struggle between expectation and reality. The intercessor's heart wants to see immediate change, but the spiritual world doesn't always bend to the human calendar. And when nothing happened, the question that haunted him was cruel. Did I fail? This type of self-attribution is one of the most common mechanisms among spiritual leaders, confusing responsibility with omnipotence. From a neuro-emotional point of view, this generates a phenomenon known as dopaminergic collapse. The brain, after periods of intense spiritual expectation, expects a reward, a visible sign, a breakthrough, a confirmation. When nothing appears, the brain experiences a chemical collapse. Low dopamine, a feeling of emptiness, loss of focus, even mild depressive symptoms. The intercessor interprets this as a lack of anointing, when in reality it is just biology reacting to the accumulation of frustrated hope. Here is the great inversion of logic in this chapter. Results do not authenticate prayer. Prayer authenticates the person who prays. Spiritual maturity is not born from frequent miracles, but from faithfulness even when nothing changes. Bounds learned this the hard way. There were days when his prayer didn't move circumstances, but moved his essence. It didn't change cities, but changed his very being. And this, in the eyes of God, is formation, not failure. To deal with this dilemma, there is an essential practice, what we call prayer without constraints, a daily rhythm where the person prays with intention, but without demanding that the present moment produce immediate results. It is a way to free the soul from the idolatry of spiritual performance. You pray, surrender, breathe, and don't obsessively monitor what comes next. It is discipline against spiritual anxiety, and that is how intercessors survive decades without breaking down inside. The final image of this chapter is that of embers hidden under ashes. At first glance, it seems that nothing is happening, just cold ash. But underneath, the heat is there, silently accumulating energy. This unnoticed heat is what later becomes a flame that ignites everything around it. Such was the prayer of E.M. Bounds. Silent, discreet, often unanswered, but charged with a heat that prepared future awakenings. There is a kind of spiritual greatness that doesn't spring from talent, nor from emotional intensity, nor from epic moments of religious ecstasy. It springs from something far less glamorous. Years of microscopic constancy, repeated faithfulness, small choices that seem insignificant at the moment, but that accumulate eternal weight. For E.M. Bounds, this was the true cradle of his authority, not his greatest prayers, but his smallest. What he did day after day, without witnesses, without immediate results, without applause. The pain of this chapter is the universal feeling of insignificance. When someone prays for years and sees almost nothing change, the temptation is to give up. Bounds faced this repeatedly. He fought against fatigue, against doubt, against the feeling of wasting his life in silence while the world rushed around him. But what kept his flame alive? The conviction that God works more slowly than human beings, but always more deeply. And that's where the miracle of long obedience begins, when you learn to value process over sensation. From a neuroscientific point of view, this continuous perseverance creates something we call the neuroplasticity of resilience. The brain, exposed to habits of consistency, reorganizes its circuits of attention, patience, and emotional regulation. In other words, you become someone capable of sustaining more spiritual weight over the years. Bounds wasn't just a man of great prayers. He was a man who trained his nervous system to remain stable, focused, and compassionate when most would crumble. This stability, built blow by blow, day after day, is what generates real authority. Here's the great revelation of this chapter. Spiritual authority doesn't come from the volume of your prayer, but from the survival of your commitment. Authority is what remains when all shortcuts fail, when all shortcuts become discouraging, when all emotions evaporate, and you remain faithful. This kind of authority isn't noisy. It doesn't impress on first encounter, but it moves atmospheres, because it has been tempered over time. Bounds became who he was not, because he prayed a lot in 1 month, but because he never gave up for decades. To apply this principle today, there is a powerful tool called long obedience audit. It works like this. Choose an area of your spiritual life where you don't need more intensity. You need consistency. It could be Bible reading, intercession for a specific person, monthly fasting, daily silence, or silent service. The question is not how to become more fervent. The question is how to maintain this for 5 years. Make a small, repeatable, sustainable plan, because the kingdom of God does not respond to impulses. It responds to roots. The image that closes this chapter is that of a sword in the process of being forged. It is not the strongest blow that makes the weapon. It is the sum of thousands of blows, repeated, rhythmic, applied with patience. It is heat, hammer, cooling, repetition. This is what a true intercessor is like. Not someone who burns out once, but someone who remains burning long enough to change their own inner structure. Bounds was not great because he was extraordinary, but because he was unalterably faithful. Every generation looks to figures like E.M. Bounds and wonders, how does someone become so profound, so steadfast, so inflamed by God, without destroying themselves along the way? The answer is far from spiritual romanticism. It wasn't talent. It wasn't charisma. It wasn't emotional intensity. It was the furnace. Bounds' influence wasn't born in pulpits, nor in the pages of books that shape generations today. It was born in the part of life that no one sees, the place where the soul is taken to the heat that melts pride, corrects motivations, exposes weaknesses, and gradually molds a character firm enough to bear eternal weight. Before his public legacy came his private reconstruction. The furnace wasn't punishment. It was preparation. It was God refining, not destroying. It was the necessary process for Bounds not only to pray eloquently, but to become a man whose prayers had density, inner coherence, spiritual substance. The inner fire eliminated everything that couldn't enter the next chapter of his life. Unnecessary pressures, fragile identities, wrong expectations, dependence on results, so that only what was solid remained. The great modern temptation is to seek impact without accepting the warmth that forms people capable of sustaining it, to seek authority without brokenness, to seek anointing without vulnerability. But every real revival, every lasting ministry, every man or woman of deep prayer goes through the same process. The furnace that purifies, not the fire that consumes. And here is the final invitation. Observe your own moments of pressure, contradiction, weariness, silence, or exposure. Don't see them as failure or rejection, but as furnaces of formation. As the space where God is strengthening the inner walls of your heart, so that what he plans to place upon you will not crush you. What hurts now may be exactly what will make you capable later. Revival is not born from comfort. It is born from people willing to allow God to eliminate what cannot enter the next level, so that he can strengthen what needs to remain.